The wind was a sculptor, and the world its unforgiving marble. It carved the snow into waves of frozen white, sheared the bark from the ancient pines, and scraped the last vestiges of warmth from Elias Thorne's hollowed-out heart. His ranch was a kingdom of isolation, bordered by barbed wire and the biting silence of a Wyoming winter. For 5 years, since the day the earth had claimed his wife, Sarah, this silence had been his only trusted companion. It asked no questions. It offered no pity. It simply was. Each day was a ritual of survival: chop the wood, feed the few remaining cattle whose sad eyes mirrored his own, stare at the horizon until it bled into the bruised purple of twilight, and then retreat into the log cabin that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The hearth was the only thing he tended with something resembling care, a single point of defiant light against the encroaching dark. On this day, however, the wind brought more than just cold. It carried a sound, thin and sharp, a needle of noise that pierced the blanket of the storm. Elias, his hand resting on the worn axe handle, stilled. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the groan of a straining tree. It was human. He told himself to ignore it. He wasn't a savior. He was a ghost, tending the graveyard of his own life. The world and its troubles had been locked out long ago, the key thrown into the same chasm where his laughter lay buried. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a desperate plea swallowed by the gale. It snagged on a raw nerve he thought had died with Sarah. Cursing himself, the world, and the God he no longer spoke to, he pulled his collar tight and strode toward the fence line, his boots sinking into the deepening drifts. What he found would forever shatter his carefully constructed solitude. Against the grey expanse, there was a patch of impossible color, the faded crimson of a thin jacket. In it was a girl, barely a teenager, half buried in a snowbank. Her face was a porcelain mask of blue-tinged white, her lips cracked and bloodless. Her eyes were open, staring but not seeing, filmed over with a terrifying emptiness. In her lap, her hands were curled uselessly, and her legs were twisted at an angle that spoke of a brutal, profound wrongness. She wasn't just cold, she was discarded. A piece of broken humanity left to be erased by the snow. Elias knelt, his own breath pluming in the frigid air. For a moment, he was paralyzed by the sheer inhumanity of it. Who does this? Who leaves a child, a helpless child, to die in the teeth of a blizzard? He saw the tracks, a single set, leading from the girl to the distant ribbon of asphalt that passed for a road. Tire tracks, already fading, from a heavy vehicle that had stopped just long enough to commit this atrocity. There was no deliberation. There was no choice. The part of him that was still human, the part that Sarah had loved, took over. With a groan that was part effort and part anguish, he gently scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bird with broken wings. As he carried her back toward the defiant light of his cabin, he could feel the faint, fluttering beat of her heart against his chest, a desperate drum tapping out a message of survival against all odds. He had just invited the world, in all its cruelty and all its pain, back across his threshold. The silence was broken. The warmth of the cabin worked a slow, painful magic. Elias had laid her on the thick bearskin rug before the hearth, stripping away the frozen, useless jacket and wrapping her in the heavy woolen blankets that still smelled faintly of Sarah's lavender soap. The scent was a punch to the gut, a ghost rising from the folds of fabric. For hours, he worked silently, methodically, forcing lukewarm, sugary water between her blue lips with a spoon, rubbing her frozen limbs until his own arms ached. He was a man of the earth, he knew how to bring a half-frozen calf back from the brink, and the grim principles were the same. But this was different. This was a human soul, and the cold that clung to her felt deeper than frost, a chill that radiated from within. He watched the flicker of life return to her eyes, the terrifying emptiness slowly receding, replaced by a dawning, frantic fear. Her name, he would learn, was Lena. The word came out as a cracked whisper, her gaze darting around the rustic cabin, flinching at every shadow, every creak of the old logs. She tried to move, to sit up, and a choked cry of agony and frustration escaped her. It was then that the full, horrifying truth of her condition became clear. I can't feel them, she wept, her terrified eyes locked on her own legs, which lay unnaturally still beneath the blankets. Since the accident, I can't feel anything over the next day. As the storm raged outside, trapping them in a bubble of forced intimacy, the story came out in painful fragments. The accident had been a fall, she said, down a flight of stairs at the lavish city home of her stepfather, a wealthy and influential man named Marcus Vance. She spoke of him with a tremor in her voice, a mixture of awe and deep-seated dread. He was her guardian since her mother passed away. He had been driving her, she explained, to a supposed specialist clinic in the mountains. He'd said the fresh air would do her good. Then, the car had stopped. He had carried her out, his face a mask of cold indifference she had never seen before, and laid her in the snow. He told me to wait, she whispered, tears tracking clean paths down her grimy cheeks. He said someone would be along to pick me up. A new doctor. He said he couldn't look at me anymore. That I was a reminder of his failure. The story was monstrous, but it felt incomplete, the edges blurred with trauma and fear. Elias listened, his face an unreadable granite slab, but inside, a storm of his own was brewing. He knew men like Vance. Not personally, but he knew the type. Men who saw people as assets or liabilities, wins or losses on a ledger. His Sarah, a tenacious investigative journalist, had spent the last year of her life building a case against just such a man, a corporate titan whose company, Titan Minerals, was poisoning the water table in 3 counties. She had amassed a mountain of evidence, proof of cover-ups, of falsified reports, of lives ruined for profit. Then, one rainy night, on her way back from a secret meeting with a whistleblower, a truck had crossed the center line. A tragic accident, the police report said. Case closed. Elias had never believed it. He just hadn't had the strength to fight it. Now, looking at this broken girl, this piece of human collateral discarded by a powerful man, the cold embers of his own rage began to glow. He saw Sarah's fire in Lena's frightened eyes. He heard the echo of his own helplessness in her weeping. He was a struggling rancher, barely keeping his head above water, his savings dwindling with every passing season. Taking on a paralyzed teenager was not just an inconvenience, it was a potential ruin. He had no money for doctors, for therapies, for the endless needs she would have. His solitude was his shield, his poverty his cage. Turning her over to the authorities seemed the logical, sensible thing to do. They could find her a proper facility, a place with resources he could never provide. But sending her away meant sending her back into the system, back into the world where men like Marcus Vance held all the cards. It meant turning his back, just as Vance had done. He looked at her, huddled by the fire that was the only warmth in his world, and he saw not just a stranger, but a reflection. A chance. Not just to save her, but to save what was left of himself. What would you do in this situation? Would you choose the safety of your isolation, or would you risk everything for a stranger who represents a past you cannot escape? Tell us in the comments. For Elias, the choice crystallized in the quiet of the cabin. He looked at the shotgun resting above the mantel, not as a tool for hunting, but as a promise. He would not turn her away. This was his fence line now. And he would defend it. The decision settled in his soul like stone. It wasn't a grand, heroic revelation, but a quiet, grim acceptance of a new reality. His life of chosen exile was over. The storm outside broke the next morning, leaving the world pristine and deceptively peaceful, sunlight glinting off a sea of untouched snow. But the peace was a lie. Elias knew it. He could feel the threat gathering on the horizon, as tangible as the winter cold. He spent the day turning his home from a refuge into a fortress. He checked the sight on his father's old hunting rifle, his movements economical and sure. He stacked extra firewood by the doors and windows, not just for warmth, but for barricades. Lena watched him from her makeshift bed by the fire, her fear a palpable presence in the room. Every sound, the wind in the eaves, the distant call of a hawk, made her jump. He tried to offer what comfort he could, which wasn't much. His words were clumsy, unpracticed after years of disuse. "You're safe here," he'd said, and the words felt like foreign objects in his mouth. But his actions spoke a language she understood. He built a ramp of rough-hewn planks over the cabin's 2 steps so he could wheel her outside in an old, rickety chair he'd found in the barn. For the first time, he pushed her out into the blindingly bright afternoon. The crisp air, free of the city's grime, filled her lungs. For a moment, a genuine, fragile smile touched her lips. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The real test came 2 days later. It arrived not as a storm, but as a sleek, black SUV, its tires crunching on the gravel of his long driveway. The vehicle was an alien artifact in this world of rust and wood, a predator in a land of prey. 2 men in expensive-looking coats emerged. They weren't thugs, they were worse. They were polite. They moved with an easy confidence that spoke of money and the power it bought. Elias met them on the porch, the old shotgun held loosely, almost casually, in the crook of his arm. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat. The taller of the 2 men smiled, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Thorne? We're representatives for Mr. Marcus Vance. We believe you may have found something that belongs to him." "A girl," he said the word girl as if describing a misplaced piece of luggage. Elias's grip tightened on the shotgun. "Don't know anything about it." The man's smile didn't falter. "Let's not be difficult. Mr. Vance is a very concerned guardian. He's willing to offer a substantial reward for her safe return. $10,000. For your trouble." He slid a crisp envelope from his coat pocket. $10,000. The number hung in the air, a beautiful, seductive lie. It was more money than Elias had seen in years. It could fix the leaking barn roof, buy a new herd of cattle, pay off the debts that were slowly strangling him. It could buy him back his life of comfortable misery. He could see the flash of this thought in the man's eyes. They had researched him. They knew his struggles. They were trying to buy his poverty, not his loyalty. He thought of Lena's terrified face. He thought of Sarah, and the price of silence. "The only thing that belongs on my property is what I allow to be here," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "I'd suggest you turn that vehicle around and get off it." The man's politeness finally cracked. The smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold annoyance. "Mr. Thorne, you're making a grave mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with and you have no idea where you are," Elias retorted, his gaze sweeping over the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. "Out here, money doesn't keep you warm. And your boss isn't the only one with concerned friends. The sheriff in town, he and my father were old hunting buddies. He knows I'm up here. He also knows I'm alone. He'd find it mighty peculiar if I suddenly went quiet, especially after having visitors." It was a bluff, mostly. He hadn't spoken to Sheriff Brody in years. But it landed. The men exchanged a look. This was more complicated than they'd anticipated. The taller man sighed, tucking the envelope away. "As you wish. Mr. Vance will be disappointed." It was a clear threat. They returned to their SUV, their movements no longer confident, but sharp, angry. As the vehicle retreated down the driveway, a plume of dust in its wake, Elias knew this was only the beginning. He had refused the carrot. Now came the stick. He went back inside, the cold dread returning. Lena was pale, having heard everything from the window. "They'll come back, won't they?" she whispered. Elias looked at her, and for the first time, he gave her a sliver of the truth, of his truth. "Yes," he said. "But we'll be ready." The ranch was no longer a refuge from his past, it had become the battlefield for his future. The return of Marcus Vance was not a matter of if, but when. The quiet days that followed the departure of his men were fraught with a new kind of tension. It wasn't the lonely silence of grief, but the charged silence of a coming battle. Elias and Lena fell into a routine born of necessity. He would tend to the ranch, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, while she, propped up with pillows by the window, became his lookout. She read to him from one of Sarah's old books of poetry, her voice growing stronger each day, filling the cabin with words that had been gathering dust for years. They were two broken people, finding a strange sort of wholeness in their shared predicament. A fierce, protective bond was forging between them, hammered into shape by fear and defiance. The final confrontation began not with a bang, but with the chillingly modern sound of a satellite phone ringing. The device had been dropped by Vance's men during their hasty retreat, a mistake Elias knew was a deliberate opening move. He answered it. The voice on the other end was smooth, cultured, and dripping with condescending authority. "Mr. Thorne. Marcus Vance. I do hope my associates weren't too uncivilized." It's so hard to find good help. Elias remained silent, listening to the man's arrogant monologue. Vance explained, with chilling calm, that Lena was a liability. Not just emotionally, but financially. The girl, you see, had a penchant for snooping, Vance said, his tone conversational. "Much like your late wife, I believe. Sarah, wasn't it? Such a tragedy. These crusading types, they never understand the consequences." The name, Sarah, spoken by this man, was a hot poker to Elias's soul. The world tilted. The past and present violently collided. Lena found some documents, Vance continued, papers related to an old business merger. Unfortunate. They proved, shall we say, that the tragic accident that befell her mother wasn't entirely accidental. And that the subsequent acquisition of her family's assets wasn't entirely legal. My accident, her paralysis, a regrettable but necessary measure to ensure her silence. Just as your wife's accident was necessary to protect my interests in Titan Minerals, there it was. The truth, laid bare. The monster who had ruined his life was the same monster trying to destroy this child. This wasn't just about protecting Lena anymore. This was a reckoning 5 years in the making. "I'm coming for her, Thorne," Vance said, his voice hardening. "You can't protect her. You couldn't even protect your own wife." The line went dead. Elias stood motionless, the phone clutched in his hand, his knuckles white. The grief he had buried for 5 years erupted, not as sadness, but as pure, cold rage. This was his chance. To fight back. To finally face the ghost that had haunted his every waking moment. The assault came at dusk. 2 black SUVs, flanking a larger, more opulent one, rolled up the driveway and stopped just beyond the fence line. Floodlights mounted on the vehicles blazed to life, bathing the small cabin in a harsh, interrogating glare. Vance stepped out, a silhouette of tailored evil against the blinding light. He didn't rush. He stood there, a king surveying a peasant's hovel. "It's over, Thorne," he yelled through a megaphone, his amplified voice booming across the valley. "Send out the girl, and I might let you live out the rest of your pathetic life in this glorified shack." Elias moved with deadly purpose. He placed Lena, wrapped in blankets, in the root cellar, its thick earthen walls the safest place in the house. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his eyes locking with hers. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw trust. A profound, absolute trust that healed a part of him he thought was dead forever. He handed her a small, charged walkie-talkie. "If you hear anything other than my voice, you call Sheriff Brody. The number's written on the back. You tell him everything." Then he went to war. He didn't fight them head-on. That would be suicide. He used the land. The darkness beyond their floodlights was his ally. He slipped out the back, a phantom moving through the familiar woods. He had spent years walking these hills, learning every rock, every tree, every dip in the terrain. Vance's men, city-bred and arrogant, stumbled through the darkness, their powerful flashlights cutting useless beams through the dense pines. Elias became a ghost, a whisper of vengeance. A rope snare sent one man swinging into a tree. A carefully dislodged pile of rocks sent another tumbling down a short, steep embankment. He used the environment as his weapon, disorienting them, separating them, picking them off one by one without firing a single shot. Finally, it was just Vance, standing impatiently by his vehicle, screaming threats into the night. Elias circled back, emerging from the shadows behind him, the barrel of his rifle cold and steady. "You were right," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. "I couldn't protect my wife. That's a failure I'll carry to my grave. But I will not fail this child." Vance spun around, his face a mask of shock and fury. He reached for a pistol tucked into his coat, but he was too slow. Elias fired, not at Vance, but at the ground next to his feet. The shot echoed through the valley like a clap of thunder. Vance froze, his hand hovering over his weapon. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted entirely. Here, in the wild heart of the Wyoming mountains, Vance's money and influence were worthless. He was just a man, facing another man who had nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. The distant sound of sirens began to cut through the night, a faint wail growing steadily louder. Lena had made the call. It was over. Vance's face crumpled, the arrogant mask falling away to reveal the coward beneath. Elias stood over him, not as a killer, but as a protector. He hadn't just defeated an enemy, he had reclaimed his own soul from the ashes of his grief. The aftermath was a blur of flashing blue and red lights against the snow, of sharp commands cutting through the night air, and the surreal sight of Marcus Vance and his men being led away in handcuffs. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of weathered kindness and hard-won wisdom, clapped Elias on the shoulder. "You should have called me sooner, son," he said, his voice gruff with concern. No man should have to carry a burden like this alone. It was the first time in 5 years Elias felt like he wasn't alone, and the realization was as staggering as the events of the night. The days that followed were filled with the tedious machinery of the law, statements, interviews, and the slow, grinding process of justice. Lena's testimony, corroborated by the document she had bravely secured, was the nail in Vance's coffin. It not only exposed his attempt on her life and the fraudulent acquisition of her family's fortune, but it also reopened the cold case of Sarah Thorne. The truck driver from Sarah's accident was located, and faced with the collapse of Vance's empire, he confessed everything. Justice for Sarah had finally arrived, not through a dramatic courtroom battle led by Elias, but as a consequence of his simple, profound act of kindness toward a broken child. As the legal dust settled, a new reality emerged. Elias Thorne, the grieving recluse, became Lena's legal guardian. The state, seeing the unshakable bond between them, knew there was no better place for her. The ranch, once a monument to loss, began its slow transformation into a sanctuary of healing. The $10,000 from Vance's impounded assets, ironically, was awarded to Lena as a first step in restitution. They used it not for cattle or barn repairs, but for a down payment on the best physical therapy and medical care they could find. The journey was long and arduous. There were days of frustration and tears, moments when the physical and emotional pain seemed insurmountable. But they faced it together. Elias learned a new language, one of patience, of encouragement, of quiet pride in every small victory, a flicker of movement in a toe, the successful transfer from bed to wheelchair, the first time she could hold a pen steady. He was no longer just a rancher, he was a caregiver, a mentor, a father. The silence of the cabin was replaced by the sound of Lena's determined grunts during therapy exercises, by her laughter as Elias told her stories about a brave and brilliant woman named Sarah, and by the music she began to play on an old guitar he'd repaired for her. Years flowed by like a gentle river. The seasons turned, each one washing away a little more of the pain and replacing it with strength. Lena, fueled by a fire inherited from her mother and fanned into flame by Sarah's memory, excelled. She finished high school at the top of her class through online courses and set her sights on law school, driven by a fierce desire to fight for those the world deemed disposable. The ranch thrived, not because it became more profitable, but because it was filled with life again. The final, defining moment came on a bright autumn afternoon nearly a decade after that fateful blizzard. Elias stood in the back of a university auditorium, his face weathered by time but his eyes clear and full of a light that had been absent for so long. He was watching the guest speaker at the university's pre-law society welcoming event. On the stage, a young woman sat in a state-of-the-art wheelchair, her presence commanding the room. She spoke with an eloquence and passion that held the entire audience captive. She spoke of justice, of resilience, and of how the greatest acts of heroism often happen not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, desperate moments when one human being chooses to show compassion to another. She finished her speech to a thunderous, standing ovation. The dean stepped to the podium. "Let's have another round of applause for our distinguished speaker," he announced, his voice beaming with pride, the founder of the Thorn Initiative for Victims' Rights, Ms. Lena Thorne. Elias's breath caught in his throat. Lena Thorne. She had done it. She had legally taken his name, not as a replacement for the one she'd lost, but as an addition, a testament to the family they had forged in the crucible of a Wyoming winter. She had carried his name, and in doing so, had given his own life a meaning he never thought he would find again. As she wheeled off the stage, her eyes found his in the crowd. She smiled, a brilliant, beautiful smile that held all the history, all the struggle, and all the love that had passed between them. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the widower. He was Elias Thorne, Lena's father. And his heart, once a hollowed-out cavern of grief, was finally, completely full. The story of Elias and Lena is a powerful reminder that our deepest wounds can sometimes become the source of our greatest strength. It shows us that even in the bleakest of winters, a single act of compassion can ignite a fire that warms the world. What did you find most moving about Elias's transformation? Was it the moment he decided to protect Lena, or the final scene where he sees her as Lena Thorne? We'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Everyone faces moments where they can either retreat into their own world or reach out to help another. Have you ever experienced a moment like this, where a small act of kindness had a ripple effect you never expected? Share your story with our community. Your experience could be the inspiration someone else needs to hear today. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need a message of hope and redemption. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell, so you never miss a new story about the incredible power of the human spirit. Thank you for watching.